What's the hardest map of all time? After 10 years of zombies, it's kind of a tough question to answer. When you sit down and think about it, what really qualifies a map to be the hardest? Is it based on the number of rounds that people reach? How do you factor in features that exist in the game outside of the map but still affect the gameplay? Things like gobblegums and elixirs can make even the hardest map easy. Then how do you compare maps across multiple games? It's not an easy call to make, and there's certainly no formula to calculate the hardest map. This was a debate we had on Zombros recently, and a lot of the debate centered around World at War and Black Ops 1, specifically the maps Nacht der Untoten and Verrückt. Both of those maps appear in both games, and there was a lot of debate over which iteration of the map was harder. This debate reminded me that I had actually did a lot of research into this subject several months ago, but never actually did anything with that research. And after discussing it on Zombros, I felt I would actually bring this back up because it would make for an interesting video discussion. So today we'll be looking over my research to see if we can statistically prove which zombies map is the hardest. I think the most obvious way to determine how hard a map is to see what the highest round somebody has ever gotten to is on every map. The map with the lowest world record should in theory be the hardest. This methodology falls flat on its face pretty quickly once you start to think critically about the results, though. Let's take, for example, the world records of Verrückt on World at War, Black Ops 1's Call of the Dead, and Shangri-La on Black Ops 3 as reported by ZombieWorldRecords.com. World at War Verrückt has a world record of around 1,318. Black Ops 1 Call of the Dead has a world record of around 88. And Shangri-La on Black Ops 3 has a world record of 205. Now, if we take these results and compare these maps based off of difficulty, we should get Call of the Dead, Shangri-La, and Verrückt, with Call of the Dead being the hardest map and Verrückt being the easiest map. I think you could agree with me when I say that this list makes no sense. Most people would say Call of the Dead is actually a pretty easy map. When you consider that you can train in front of the lighthouse for days, it's not hard to survive on this map. The reason this map has such a low world record, though, is because there is no infinite damage wonder weapon. There also are no traps that you can rely on to kill the zombies in the later rounds. Meanwhile, a map like Verrückt on World at War is generally considered a difficult map because the layout is very tight, there's no obvious place to train, and the zombies almost feel like they're lathered in glue. For some reason, you can get stuck on them. But the reason the world record on World at War Verrückt is so high is because there's only 24 zombies per round. As a result, with the traps, you can just fly through the rounds. Also, where do you place a map like Black Ops 3 Shangri-La? Traditionally, Shangri-La is considered a difficult map. This is because, much like World at War Verrückt, there isn't an obvious place to train. It's very tight. It's the same exact layout as the Black Ops 1 one, but which one's harder? Well, Black Ops 3 Shangri-La has gobblegums, and gobblegums can really break any high round run regardless of the map. It's discrepancies like this that are the reason we just can't straight up compare rounds. What I'd like to suggest is a better way to judge maps' difficulty, and this is to actually compare the length of the game time during a world record run to determine how difficult a map is to survive in. So maps with low game times on their world record runs are actually harder maps than those with longer game times on their world record runs. Let's imagine that every map has a probability that you will go down at any given time. Now, this number isn't actually calculatable, but it could hypothetically take into consideration things like perks, wonder weapons, the map layout, the current round you're on, your current location, the location of all the zombies on the map, all the features on the map, etc. You take all of this information and plug it into some big long formula with a million different variables, and then it would spit out a probability that you will go down in the next moment. So an easier map would spit out a low probability, and a harder map would spit out a very high probability that you would go down. And this number would, of course, fluctuate throughout the game. So at round 1, your odds of going down are pretty low. But at round 10, your odds are pretty high. If you're trapped in a corner, your odds are maybe like 0.99%. But if you're just in an open area with no zombies around you, that number drops to 0. This is a number that is ever changing throughout the game and is totally situation dependent. But what you could do over the course of that entire game is average those probabilities. And then all of them, all those little trillions of mini situations would give you basically a score to determine how difficult that map is, an average probability that you're able to go down at any second. Now, this probability score would make finding the hardest map a lot easier and would cut through a lot of the subjectivity. Sadly, it's kind of impossible to calculate. Hypothetically, you can do it, but honestly, to calculate all that would just be virtually impossible. It's not something you can actually do. What you can do, though, is kind of get a sense for this number by looking at how long people are surviving. Maps with high probability scores will most likely have short game times because you're more likely to go down at any given moment. And maps with low probability scores probably have longer game times because you're not as likely to go down at any given moment. Now, I know you're probably saying, but what if during a world record run, on a map that was hard, a lot of time was wasted? So what you get is a really long game time. And this would break the system. However, remember that we're considering world record runs, where players are generally the best in the world, and they're also trying to go through the rounds as efficiently as possible. So they're not really wasting a lot of time. They're not dilly-dallying. They're trying to speed through these rounds because they might have thousands of them to go through. So we can kind of ignore this version of the game where I'm not being very efficient and I'm actually really raking up time. This is an analysis of zombie players who are surviving for world record runs and trying to do it as fast as possible, purely because they just want to get to the record as fast as possible. Now, take, for example, the World at War record for Verrückt and the Black Ops 1 record for Verrückt. It's often been debated which one is harder. The World at War world record is 1,318, and this was achieved in 20 hours. The Black Ops 1 record is 206, but it was achieved in 70 hours. So the first obvious difference is that, well, the World at War world record is a lot higher because of the 24 zombies per round. The Black Ops 1 one has, once you get into those later numbers, thousands of zombies per round. So ignore the round counter because that's totally just dependent on which game you're playing and which spawn system you're using. Instead, look at the game times. The people doing these games are the best zombie players in the world, and if one of the best zombie players in the world was only able to survive in World at War Verrückt for 20 hours straight, whereas one of the best players in the world was able to survive in Black Ops 1 Verrückt for 70 hours straight, assuming these players are being as efficient as possible and of equal skill, we can conclude that the World at War Verrückt is about 3.5 times harder than the Black Ops 1 Verrückt. So in Verrückt, if you're playing in World at War, you're 3.5 times more likely to go down than you are in Black Ops 1. So here's one thing I will say about this analysis of these numbers. It works kind of, but this is something in theory that you would want to do over a really large sample set to cut out the noise. Because what if, for example, that Black Ops 1 record where the person only survived for 70 hours? Well, what if that was just an anomaly? And what if actually an average world record quality player actually only survives for 20 hours and this guy was just on a whole nother level that day? He was killing it and totally breaks the numbers. That could be. If you were to maybe take 100 world record players and have them play each of the maps 100 times and then you compared all those times and average them out, then that gives you a much cleaner data set and reduces the likelihood that there is a statistical error. But if we just kind of look at this in a hypothetical sense and say this is one way we can look at it, this is how you can get a sense of the numbers. I'm curious what you all think. I think personally this is the best way for determining which maps are the hardest to survive on. You don't have to consider things like how many zombies there are per round or what wonder weapons are on the map or what traps there are. This is purely just based on how long you're able to train in this map without making mistakes. Maps that are harder will force you to make more mistakes, which then makes you more likely to go down, which means you'll probably have a shorter game time. This isn't a perfect methodology. Like I said, you can get statistical anomalies, and it could very well be that maybe the guy who survived in Black Ops 1 for 70 hours was just on a whole different level. You also have to consider players' personal skill, you have to consider map preference, and this is different for every single player, even the best of us. I just think this is the least flawed method for determining what's the hardest map in Zombies, and I'd be curious to know what you all think down in the comments below. With that said, that's going to wrap up this video. Have a wonderful day, and bye.